Yo, 1 2 2 1 1 2. Huh! We're up in the game. Sorry, this is not a game. That sounded like I was at the line of scrimmage and we were about to run a play, and that's not what's happening. We're live in effect with the Mestizo Coffee Click, but we are about to run some game because I'm connected here with my man, Doctor. He didn't put it there. I don't know. Maybe it's a little humility rolling in effect. Doctor Jonathan Calvillo, connecting from the East Coast. Jonathan, what's up?
What's up? What's up?
Oh,
Yeah, out here in Boston.
Boston, but you grew up on the West Coast, and in fact, we know each other from our time in school together. You were at Biola while I was at Talbot. Where did you grow up, and how'd you end up at Biola?
Yeah, well, I actually grew up not too far from there. I grew up in the city of Fullerton, and right around where the 5 and the 91 freeways meet, for folks that are familiar with that area. And then also lived for many years in Santa Ana, right down the freeway. So those are really the two cities that I've really I feel indebted to in terms of coming up in the world, growing as a human being. And then I went to college, right down the way at Biola, as you already mentioned, which is where we linked up, and we had the opportunity to work together on some hip hop related projects when we were there at the school.
That's right. You decided to go on and get a graduate degree and ultimately a PhD. What prompted you to do that? Why do that? If you're going to become a doctor, why not become a doctor who can at least help me with my back? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I got some back issues myself. So, well, I actually did other graduate work. So in some ways, you might say I followed in your footsteps. You did graduate work there at Talbot, at Biola. I actually followed up and did a Master's of Divinity there as well. And then I went off and worked in the nonprofit world, in local community-based church world as well, doing a lot of community-based nonprofit work mostly in Santa Ana, California, or Santana, as we say, and so spent about 13 years there in Santana. And during my time working in the community, I really had a lot of interest in better understanding the social dynamics of the community, the inner workings, and in particular, the role of faith in shaping the life experiences of Latinx, of Latino residents there in the community. And the community was predominantly Mexican American, so first generation immigrants, second and third generation Mexican Americans. And so I really had a lot of interest in understanding the role of faith in shaping ethnic identity. Like, what does it mean to be Mexican and Mexican American?
Why think that the tools you needed to better understand that were going to be available through some kind of doctoral education program? Because I think some people would suggest that, you could probably understand what's going on, what's impacting the spiritual lives of people in a particular neighborhood by consulting the Bible or by discerning the spirits. Why think that something like an academic discipline would unlock some truths for you?
Yeah, well, for one thing, I was really interested in conducting research, right? Like I wanted to go out and talk to people, which I was already doing in many ways. I mean, doing work in the community, you're already interacting with folks. You're spending a lot of time out and about. But for me, I wanted to do that in a systematic fashion and really hear and listen to what people are saying. And so I had gotten some theological education already, which I appreciated. And for me, the interest was now, what are people saying? How are people living these realities in the day to day? And so I wanted to go through a program, a graduate and doctoral program that would give me the tools to analyze what people were going through, what they were experiencing on the day to day, and a program that would support me to do that, a program that would support me in doing research within my own community. And so I found that not far away at the University of California at Irvine in the sociology department. I found people that I could work with there that would support the type of research that I wanted to do. And the program was even funded through a TA-ship. And so it seemed like a win-win situation where I'd be able to participate in the university life, but then I'd also have the support that I needed to go into the community and hear from people themselves, really amplify the voices of the people.
So you began to explore this discipline called, was it a sociology program? And in particular, were you looking at the sociology of religion?
Yeah, so the program itself, the PhD that I obtained is in sociology, right? So it's a sociology program in the sociology department, but my emphasis was sociology of religion, along with migration studies, and I would also say race and ethnicity focus. So we studied a lot about the dynamics of how ethnic and racial dynamics emerge. Where do they come from? What are the histories? What are the social processes that get us to the place where we're at now, and how we understand ourselves ethnically, racially? And so bringing these different topics together, the intersections of these topics, and then for me, really looking through that lens of sociology of religion, that's what allowed me to do this type of work that I've been doing. So yeah, my degree is in sociology, but my emphases are sociology of religion, race and ethnicity, immigration, and I would even add urban sociology, because I was really interested in looking at the urban context and urban communities. And so that was a major part of it also.
Yeah, the sociology of religion has a special place in my heart and mind because I actually encountered both religion and sociology probably within the same year, where I had a conversion experience as a 17-year-old and then ushered off to college at a secular university, as it were, at Brandeis, where I took my first sociology course. And I read a book called Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches by Marvin Harris, which began to, for me, the first time, unlock the way that social dynamics impact group behavior, like religion. And on the one hand, I was taking religion hyper subjectively, where this decision that I made was mine and mine alone, as if God dropped down before me, had a conversation and said, what are you going to do? Like time and space were irrelevant, right? Like in the way that it was framed for me. And then on the other hand, I started reading and thinking about not only religion, but other kind of human behavior as being impacted by forces beyond individual will or gumption or whatever. So
yeah,
talk me a little bit more about this idea of the sociology. What is the sociology of religion? What are some of the assumptions around the discipline?
Well, yeah, a good point to kind of jump off of is what you said there at the end, that interconnected experience, right? And so that was a lot of what I was interested in, how these identities are formed in an interconnected fashion in communities with other people, interrelated with other people. And so the experience of faith can be one such experience, which takes place in community or in relation to other people or in relationship with other people. And so I was really interested in how communities of people come together and shape their sense of belonging through faith. And now going back to your question, to talk a little bit more about what is sociology of religion. I mean, so sociology of religion, because it is sociology, it's really a human-centered understanding of what religion is. And when I say religion, we're looking at both in terms of beliefs, practices, and also institutions, organizations. So for example, like churches, but I mean, it can be other types of religions. So looking at, might be looking at temples or mosques or other forms of organizational structures, right? And so we're trying to understand how people come together within these structures and formulate a sense of self and a sense of community. And how do, for example, beliefs shape the way people act, how they enact social actions. For example, we look at things like how beliefs may show up in political engagement. I mean, there are a lot of different intersections, right? But at the most basic level, we're really looking at the human experience, and human at a collective level, of course, sociology, the collective human experience of faith, of religion, of faith practices, and of faith organizations.
Yeah, one or two recurring categories that seem to emerge when we talk about the sociology of religion are human religious behavior. I guess that's the only type of religious behavior, unless there's animal religious behavior, which would be a fucking breakthrough. Is like this notion of dividing the world according to the sacred and the profane, which has always fascinated me. One, because in some ways it's a helpful, clear construct. And at the same time, as a construct, maybe doesn't capture all that's involved and maybe obfuscates some truths. I guess so. How do the sacred and profane function in society, and has that shifted?
Yeah. So the idea of, I'll begin with the first part. So like the idea of the sacred, it's funny because I'll start with like, I grew up in a Pentecostal church, Latino Pentecostal church. And this idea of the sacred, or the word that we use mostly was holy, right? Something is holy. And especially because, Pentecostals really emphasize the Holy Spirit. And so what does it mean for something to be holy? And what I was taught early on was that when something is holy, it's set apart, right? And it's set apart for some sort of divine purpose or spiritual purpose. And that definition actually holds well within the field of sociology of religion. The idea of something being set apart, being distinguished because of some spiritual or divine significance. And so some of the early pioneering social theorists, such as Emil Durkheim, for example, and really his work was critical in developing this idea of the sacred and the profane within the social sciences. And so he talked about how societies develop these classifications, and they distinguish certain things as sacred and other things as profane. Those things that are sacred, again, as I said, are related to either divinity or spiritual, some sort of spiritual significance. And then you have everything else, and everything else is the profane. So we tend to think nowadays the word profane, we tend to associate it with like curse words or something, right? Like, don't use profanity or something like that. You might be told in school or something. But really, profane is actually more general than that. It's really everything outside of the sacred. It's like the mundane, the day-to-day, the sort of commonplace, normal, not particularly of spiritual significance. So you have certain things that are identified as sacred, and then you have everything outside of that, which is profane. And what some of these early theorists like Durkheim talked about is how the sacred tends to be something, an arena in which human societies project those things which are most meaningful to them. And he, I'm really condensing the argument, but he essentially argues that societies project themselves onto what they believe to be sacred. So they sort of recreate God in their image, so to speak. So that's that's kind of an early sociological argument. Now, of course, not all sociologists of religion fully buy into that, or in the very least, I think a lot of us will say, yes, there are aspects of that do happen. This projection experience does happen, but the discipline is a lot more nuanced than that. And I think people recognize that, for example, from an experiential perspective, people have all kinds of different experiences with what they label as sacred, as divine, as spiritual, and it doesn't always reflect precisely what they already valued. Sometimes people, in fact, some of the most powerful experiences are those where people say that they are actually challenged to see things in a completely different way. So like a conversion experience in some ways is this experience in which people are, feel a sense of being called to completely change the way they see things. So so in other words, what I'm saying here is that the sacred isn't merely about affirming where we're already at today or where we've already been. In some cases, it may be about affirming something that's completely different or, complete rupture from where we were. So it gets a little more complicated than that. But the idea there, again, is still that there is this sacred realm that we don't deal with flippantly. We sort of elevate it, give it a different type of importance, and then there's the profane, which we can kind of walk all over and do whatever we need to do in that arena. So yeah, that delineating the sacred and the profane, there's a whole history behind that in the discipline of sociology of religion, or the subfield, I should say, of sociology of religion.
Yeah, I can see another kind of broadside critique of that view is that it kind of turns on the assumption. Well, one, he was 19th century European man. He probably thought the whole world was like what was in front of him or whatever. But maybe all cultures don't draw. Maybe they do. I doubt that they do. I guess this is a empirical question, which probably already been answered. But all cultures don't draw this hard and fast distinction between the sacred and the profane, I imagine, or at least it's not a necessary one. And if that's true, I wonder if we begin to look for the sacred or see it in unexpected places.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. And there are a lot of critiques of that rigid sacred profane dichotomy, even as a tool of analysis, because one of the critiques is that that's a very Western view, and that it really flattens out the lived reality of many non-Western cultures, where there isn't this sharp distinction between what's sacred and profane. And so, for example, a concept like religion in some societies doesn't really play out the way it might in a lot of Western societies, where religion is really seen as this institutional expression. Like it's, religion is about belonging to some sort of denomination or established church or established, faith tradition. And there are plenty of societies, indigenous societies, and some, around the global indigenous societies, right, where it's not about belonging to this, strict compartmentalized set of practices, but rather it's intertwined. So spirituality, right, is more intertwined with the day to day. So yeah, there are, as you said, there are some problems with that rigid distinction.
Now, I will tell you, well, first, big ups, big props for releasing your book during the during the pandemic. Your book is The Saints of Santa Ana, Faith and Ethnicity in a Mexican Majority City. And I got to tell you, when I got it, that I had an emotional experience because I remember being a fucking freshman and reading these books and thinking that the person who wrote the book that I was reading was onto some shit, bro. Like I was reading some shit by someone who knew some shit. You know what I'm saying? So to see you do this, bro, was really, really dope, bro. Because I was like, people are reading your book and they think you know some shit, bro. And that's dope as fuck, bro. So big ups. But I suspect that, as part of your research in this book, which was, as you suggested, or was, what have you called it? Or I forget the category of research, ethnography.
Yeah.
That you saw this blurring of these lines? Are you found as sacred in unexpected places? Are people, Latinos in particular, sacralized public spaces, maybe, or what kind of behavior was going on?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you for that comment. I really appreciate that. And one of the things that I tried to do early on in the book is to sort of situate myself in the project and say, here's where I'm coming from. Like I'm a person of faith, and I'm interacting with mostly people of faith for this project. I'm not saying that everyone in Santana is or would see themselves as religious. Many would see themselves as spiritual, but in the project, I specifically focused on interacting with folks that did identify as spiritual or religious. And so I tried to situate myself in that as someone who comes from a faith tradition, as someone who still is committed to a faith experience. And I looked at this project as an opportunity for me to hear from people, like I was saying earlier, listen to people, rather than say, hey, this is about me telling you how you've got to do this and how you have to believe, but rather coming in and saying, okay, I'm going to listen to people's own stories. I'm going to listen to their experiences. I'm going to listen to their particular spiritual encounters to understand where they're coming from and to see the divine in that way. To hear from where folks are experiencing life transformation, for example. And then the part that you said also, how that's happening at a community level, and how community spaces, communal spaces in the neighborhood, for example, how those spaces are being sacralized, meaning how are these spaces, like these everyday spaces, being made holy and spiritual in some way, which I thought to me was one of the powerful takeaways from the project. And the reason why that was powerful is because a lot of the people that I interviewed, they've gone through, some of them, hardships, and some of them have gone through difficult migration experiences, working through issues of legal status, because the folks I interviewed were all immigrants. Not all were undocumented immigrants, but some were. And so many of them have faced discrimination and other forms of inequality. And so seeing how folks build meaning into their communities, right, through these faith practices, to me, that was powerful, because a lot of times folks lived in neighborhoods that were given negative stereotypes, neighborhoods that outsiders, when they talked about them, they would typically associate them with like, oh, that's a gang neighborhood, or, that's a neighborhood where, people go to buy drugs or something like that. And so
Stop talking about me, bro. Stop talking about my neighborhood, bro. I'm really offended right now.
All right. So okay. I thought you were trying to say that you're the one. I thought you were saying that you're the one talking about the neighborhood. All right. No. I mean, if you're repping your hood, that's cool by me. So, but what I'm saying though is that other people, outsiders, are they're talking all kinds of negativity on the neighborhood, and then to see folks through their spiritual practices create something that's valuable, build something that's valuable. Because I feel like so often we talk about working class neighborhoods, especially Latino working class neighborhoods, barrios. We talk about them in pathological ways, just everything, what's wrong here and everything, and it makes me think. So I had a flashback to this even just recently, with the young man that was shot in Chicago.
Toledo. Yep.
Yeah, Adam Toledo, right? And so, there was all kinds of debate going on about like, oh, the community failed him and the neighborhood, this and that, and what he needed was mentors and this, and it's like, okay, I'm all about mentors. I'm cool with that. But the way folks are simply just problematizing or assuming things about like his neighborhood, his community, and all of that, I mean, to me, it just reminded me of one of the reasons why I was writing this book, because I wanted to show how people are able to come together and build meaning into their communities. And I recognize that if folks are from a different faith tradition or don't subscribe to any faith tradition, they might look at that and say, oh man, that's just religion, that's religion. That's just, people kind of imagining things or whatever. But the reality is that folks are building meaning into their communities. Folks are coming together and doing something for their neighborhood. They're coming together as neighbors. Folks are taking responsibility for where they live. They're beautifying their community. They're learning to self-organize. They're sharing resources. They're taking on positions of leadership. So I'm observing all of these things happening in this space. And so when I hear these narratives of like pathology and negativity, I'm like, we need to put on a different set of lenses to really understand what's happening in these communities. And we need to understand the way that folks actually are invested in their communities.
Sure. So, like to the Toledo case, you're saying, like, had this happened in Santa Ana, the story might have read similarly in the media. But had we some like on the ground understanding of the actual lives of the people in the neighborhood, it's not the barren, desolate, godless, irresponsible fucking playground of reckless ass kids or whatever. It's much more dynamic than that.
Yeah, and for sure there are structural, issues that need to change, and that's where the book, of course, there's a lot more to be written, and there are actually people doing work on this. And to name a couple of scholars that have done work in this area, for example, in community organizing, there is, for example, Carolina Sarmiento, again in Santa Ana, that's done some tremendous work as a scholar and also through El Centro Cultural de Mexico. There's also Eduardo Gonzalez, who again has also worked with grassroots organizing, and has documented some of the history, particularly in the downtown area of Santana, and some of the organizing there. So the work is being done there. I, in particular, looked at what we call in sociology of religion, lived religion, because what I was looking for is how is sort of the everyday person, whether they are engaged politically or do, in some sort of civic engagement that they identify as such, how are they through their faith practices engaged civically? And what I found was that people were really engaged. And what are the repercussions of that in terms of ethnic identity? So, which is one of the central questions of the book, ethnic identity. How do people understand themselves as an ethnic community?
I mean, we almost can't have this conversation about Mexican and Mexican American religious experience in the U.S. without like surfacing this divide. I'm thinking I misspelled something in this thing. I keep fucking Catholic.
Okay.
I did. Oh, that's what it is. Catholicism. This is when you're so loked out on your Catholicism, like you're ready to run up on somebody. I kept reading and I was like, where's the problem here? I fucking know it somewhere. Yeah, it's a locism. But
I think you coined the new term, right?
Hey, so we actually represent two different experiences, but similar in some ways too. Insofar as one, I think you grew up in a Protestant home. I grew up in a Roman Catholic home, nominally Roman Catholic. Invited to this new fucking type of church thing where they're singing and the guy's reading in the Bible in a way that I can understand because I'm wearing blue jeans, of course. And I became overnight this thing called a born again Christian, which I came to learn meant, to my chagrin, that had been subsumed under this larger kind of cultural fucking movement that harbored a lot of backwards ass thinking. That aside, it does. I do remember feeling as if I had somehow betrayed some kind of ethnic allegiance by stopping going to Catholic church, like the baptism, which was such an important marker, the confirmation, which I participated in, like all that shit was going to be gone for my kids. You know what I'm saying? And I was like, ugh, but this is what I have to do or whatever. So like this, I'm curious, and I guess we can get too deep into this, but I'm wondering, in the U.S., how does it break out? How many Mexicans are they? Mostly Protestant, mostly Catholic? What are the numbers here?
Oh man, okay, you got me on the numbers question.
I almost didn't want to ask it because I didn't want to hit you. I didn't want to fucking hit you with it. But that's like a top line. Like, who are we?
Yeah. I mean, generally, so in the Latino population, we're looking at like about a fourth Protestant, and I'll get the exact numbers for you in a little bit. But it's we're looking at about a fourth, and then we're looking at it's getting down when you talk about Catholic affiliation. It's now coming down to like the 50% mark, and there are questions about whether it will go below that or not. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the group that's actually growing the most, or the fastest, I should say, the fastest. It's not the most numerically, but it's the fastest, is non-religious. So a lot of the conversation and in the book,
Sure.
my focus is on Protestants and Catholics, but the group that's grown the fastest is the non-affiliated.
Yeah, I almost, and here I quibble too, because, and I like to quibble, so, but here I quibble with the idea that the unaffiliated are unreligious, but that's maybe
yeah. That's a good catch. That's a good catch, because a lot of these folks are very spiritual when we're talking about I prefer non-affiliated, because they may not be affiliated with an institution, but they may still be very spiritual in their practices. So you've got about 61% of ethnic Mexicans in the U.S. are Catholic, about 61%. And that number is already a bit dated. So that number is already a few years old. It may have changed a bit. In the larger Latinx population, it's 55%. So traditionally, people of Mexican origin have had a more substantial Catholic affiliation than other Latinos and other Latin American origin groups. A couple others are right up there, like Dominicans are fairly high up there as well. But then you got other folks from, like, for example, El Salvador and Guatemala that have very high evangelical Protestant affiliations as well. So it kind of, the numbers are fluctuating. That's one of the reasons why this has been a big story, and one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on this as well, is because it's one of these stories that's changing as we go, right? These affiliations are not set in stone. Folks are changing. Folks are moving in different directions. And also, we have to look at it through the generational lens as well, which is it's changing across generation, which is what you brought up. I mean, you brought up that question of what are you passing on to your children, right? And so for someone like me, I mean, my family has been Protestant now for a few generations, for a couple of generations. So me remaining in some type of Protestant affiliation is sort of a continuity of where my grandparents already were, for example. So maybe I don't feel it as pronounced, that change. I don't necessarily feel it, because for me it doesn't entail a generational change. Whereas other folks that I interviewed and talked to, they had an experience similar to what you described, where they had kind of a born again experience and became Protestant, having been born Catholic. So that was one of the main themes, as you saw in the book. I talk a lot about this conversion experience that a lot of people tell me about. And it ends up being one of the, what I consider one of the markers of evangelical identity. It's this conversion experience. If you haven't had some sort of conversion experience, then you're not really part of the community, like of the evangelical community. If you haven't had some sort of identifiable point where you made that commitment to follow Jesus Christ, and it's usually, it usually happens in a certain way. Oftentimes it'll happen like at a church service or through a prayer or something like that, right? And that's part of the tradition. And I would even say it's part of the tradition that I come from, because these are the experiences that I lived through as well. And so when you compare the Catholic experience, you name some of those experiences. There are some very important milestones in the Catholic experience as well. It's not like the Catholic experience is just about being born Catholic. I mean, folks are going through these different sacramental experiences, right? And one of the things I observed is that going through the sacraments in these communities in Santa Ana were oftentimes community-based experiences that are celebrated in the community, like when, baptism or primera comunión, first communion, right? Or, particularly those two, oftentimes there was a party being thrown or like a celebration taking place. So these become, at the community level, these become markers of belonging also. Going through these experiences are not just individual kind of personal spiritual things. These are things that are happening at the community level, and folks are like, folks are participating, helping each other out. So what does that mean when one group is doing this in that way, and then you got another group that sort of breaks away from that, right? So that's where that ethnic identity question comes in.
It's also a testament to the power of the demos, the people, the masses, to transform in some ways. It's not only that the people are changing. We've fucking seen these institutions change, bro. So we've seen the Catholic Church in LA and in greater LA, Southern California, start to adopt Protestant and Pentecostal kind of forms of worship as a way of listening to the demands of the people. And we know that the church, through our experiences, direct experiences, that the Protestant church is, for me, as during my time as a gospel rapper, opened up the stage to a lot of brown artists to come in and develop a craft and share a message and do all that kind of thing. As an institution, as a unique type of institution, So I know that you're starting to look at some of that in your work, the way that the creative arts help to formulate identity and how the locations of that weren't always secular.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so cultural production is certainly not just a secular or profane endeavor. And so that's where the lines get blurry again, where you say, well, that's, there's this rigid sort of religious realm, and then there's this kind of everyday secular profane kind of, in Spanish, people might say lo cotidiano, the quotidian. And so what I'm finding is that, those lines are blurred oftentimes. And in some of my research on cultural production within the Latino, the Latinx community, what I'm finding is that some of these religious spaces were actually very important to the production of popular culture. And so one of the projects that I'm looking at now, so number one, I'm doing a follow-up project to this church-based study that I did. And so I'm looking at some of the practices that take place within churches and how culture is performed within these churches, right? And how churches become centers of cultural production and specifically of ethnic cultural production or of assimilation, because they may also be centers that are encouraging folks to lose some of their cultural practices. So that's a question that I'm asking, right?
Raul Reese. please come to the front.
Wow. Okay. All right. All right.
Hey, I got
Yeah.
nothing
Yeah.
else to do but to call.
Yeah. 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 So, but so one of the other things, so I've got, so that's one project, the follow up to the book. So I'm working through that right now. So be on the lookout for that. I don't have a name for it yet, but it's in the works. And then I've got another project that relates to that as well. And it relates to a specific arena of cultural production, namely hip hop culture. And so I'm looking at how hip hop culture in the greater LA area was produced in such a way that allowed space for Latinos to be a part of that process. Now, this, of course, is a cultural movement primarily spearheaded by Black artists and largely connected to Afro-diasporic cultures going back for generations. So hip hop is an expression of an ongoing confluence of Afro-diasporic cultures, and yet Latinos enter into the picture. Of course, outside of my research, well, I wouldn't say outside. I mean, I'm doing some research on what others have done already, like in New York City, for example. But what I'm looking at is on the West Coast, and the original research I'm doing is more focused on the West Coast and how Latinos on the West Coast began to engage and participate and co-create within the hip hop space. And again, as I said, a predominantly Black African American space. And so you have Latinos, not only you have some that were, classified as perhaps mestizos or from a variety of different regions, because LA we think of as predominantly Chicano oftentimes, but in my research I'm finding Central Americans, Nicaraguenses, Guatemalans, Salvadorans that are a part of this scene as well early on. And so part of my project is looking at the scene early on, because one of the arguments I'm making is that there was sort of this cultural moment at the early foundational period of West Coast hip hop. So when hip hop starts to emerge as an identifiable movement from East Coast, transplanted onto the West Coast and adapted to the West Coast culture, built upon foundational movements already existing on the West Coast, you have Latinos early on.
Let's stop, because you're being really careful, and I'm catching all your qualifications. So if you're listening, slow your roll, because you need to he's being very careful in all how he's qualifying each of the claims. As you know, historical claims are tendentious, to say the least. And any history that attempts to tell the story by gathering information from as many people involved as possible is going to be more complicated than a top-down telling. And so I wanted to note that is a particular interest. And let me just point one thing out. A particular interest is this notion that what was happening on this East Coast. Okay, this is all framed by this idea, like a silly idea, even like who has proprietorship over this culture or some shit, like who can say it's ours and it's not yours or whatever. So insofar as that's a operating framework, what happened on the East Coast that made its way to the West Coast had to integrate into the elements that were already happening, whose form was strikingly similar, and maybe even similar enough, I would probably argue, to say it was kind of the same shit happening all along. But it wasn't as if it was a straight mapping onto an empty canvas in LA who was empty of any street culture or music culture or dance culture or culture.
Yeah, most definitely there's adaptation happening. And so part of what this project is about is, I'm asking the question, one of the underlying questions I have in this other project is, did Latinos have any role in this process of adaptation in which East Coast hip hop, New York City, Bronx hip hop is being adapted to the West Coast context, did Latinos have any hand in that experience, in that process? And I would argue, yes, they did. Now, again, I'm very careful because, as I said earlier, this is an Afro-diasporic culture. It emerges from a confluence of Afro-diasporic cultural movements. And some Latinos are part of that Afro-diasporic confluence, meaning that some Latinos are of African descent. And one of the interesting things is, yes, even on the West Coast, you have some Afro-Latinos that are present and in the mix. And so that's something I want to highlight. But you have a mix. I was saying, you had some that were more, kind of mestizo. You have Chicanos, you have folks from South America, Central America, the Caribbean, that are part of this early scene. And they're the minority. They're in the minority, I would say, but they're active and they're doing something. So I want to highlight some of these stories. That's one of the things that I want to do. And I also want to, just like in my book that I have already, where I talk about ethnic and racial identities, I want to talk about hip hop as a space of ethnic and racial identity formation. Like what was happening during that early period where you have Latinos active in a predominantly Black cultural movement. What sort of ethnic and racial negotiations are going on there? So that's what I'm asking.
And your field of study is not without controversy. Like, whew, we're gonna have John Gill on hopefully soon, who I connected with recently, who's an interesting philosopher of hip hop. I guess that thing now. Mm-hmm. My man teaches a course on the philosophy of battle rap. That's so fucking dope. Wow. So yeah, I think this is interesting, especially how we tell the stories of the emergence of culture, particular cultures. And I'm excited to have you on here. When we connected, I was like, I want this to be like, not unlike, at least, when these videos I see, my neighbor's kid, shout out my neighbor's kid, will go on, and he's like maybe 13, and he does his karate lessons on, and it's katas or whatever, and it's like he's not really fighting anybody, bro. You know what I'm saying? But it's a good demonstration of form.
Yeah.
And I like inviting my smart friends on to provide the demonstration of form and how we can carefully think through these issues, and do it from different perspectives, and and then to go from talking about the sacred and the profane to hip hop. And back to coffee, which, as you can see from the scroll on the bottom of the screen, you can grab some coffee at mestizo.coffee.
Well, I skipped the part real quick, but let me just tie it back to the particular bridge that you had built, which is that one of the things I found is that faith communities were a part of this equation of creating space for some of these early artists to express themselves and even to develop their skills. So whether it was a traditional church or whether it was someone that created a space that isn't a traditional church, but they were motivated by their faith, right? Like they felt some sort of imperative based on their faith orientation, based on their beliefs. And so they created a space, and you have early contributions from Latinos in that way, opening these spaces where artists are developing and contributing to the West Coast scene. And that's a story that from that early period isn't really being told much at all. There's some great research later on. So you, for example, you've got a book, Holy Hip Hop in the City of Angels, by Cristina Sanfagna. Great work there. This one, I'm taking it back to that early phase, that early period. We're talking like early 80s. I'm even interviewing folks that were around in the 70s that were part of the cultures that were precursors to West Coast hip hop, right? So I'm hearing from them.
Yeah, it just struck me that back to this notion of the sacred and the profane, the fact that it was the Catholic notion of the sacred that prevented us from ever trying to get on fucking stage at a church. Like, do not come up here, bro. This is sacred. The Protestant notion of the sacred, though, invited folk up to the stage. And just like seeing that principle at work differently in the two contexts kind of impacts what was able to happen in those spaces.
Yeah.
And now all that said and done, I think I've gone black, but you can hear me. All that's said and done. I actually, I don't even know. So if I had to like identify my impulse, like what do I favor in terms of modes of like religious reflection? I don't know, bro. I like them both, I guess. I don't know. I resist. I don't even know. I don't even know what to say. How about you? What do you? I thought you were going to say, you know what, you're thinking about going back to Catholicism and flipping your whole fucking your progeny moving forward. We're gonna, be Catholic or something.
Oh, you're saying that I would do that?
No, I thought that's where you were going when you were saying there's many generations and like you're at a place.
Oh yeah.
Like it's just as likely for you to revert. I mean, there are people going back to Catholicism like I had initially kind of.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's even a whole movement. There's even a movement of people in Latin America becoming Muslim, and the idea that that's conceptualized is as a reversion. They're reverting. They're not converting. They're reverting. At least that's the way. That's sort of the narrative that they are putting forth.
Reverting.
Reverting. Yeah, because the idea is that Islam was in Spain and had a presence already there for hundreds of years. And so some folks are seeing that as an embrace of something that was present. Now, of course, you have similar moves going towards like indigenous spiritualities as well as a way to sort of reconnect, right? For me, a lot of my research, I've got a number of other mini projects that are more like history based as well. I've got one where I'm looking at early Protestantism in New Mexico and migrations from New Mexico to Southern California in like the 1800s. So some of that, what some of that is doing, it's helping me to understand, on a scholarly level, like some of these religious migration patterns, and then on a personal level, it's helping me to understand like, oh, okay, so this is where some of my own traditions came from, like some of what I've been taught early on. It actually goes farther back than just like a conversion experience that happened, a certain number of years ago. It actually goes back like beyond a century, like, a century and a half or more. Right. And so that's helped me to understand like where the communities that I was raised in, what were some of the things that shaped them. And also because a lot of times we are taught to think of those communities purely from the perspective of like, well, Christianity is a white man's religion, so you hear that kind of thing. Right. And sure enough, especially when talking about Latin America and the Caribbean, Christianity largely came to those places through Europeans. And so we do recognize that aspect of it. But even within the Americas, and of course, there's all this research on like Christianity in Africa before that and all of that, right? So that exists. But part of what I'm doing also is I'm trying to nuance the story by saying, well, okay, what were people doing with their faith? Like, just like we talked about with this movement of hip hop from east to west and like this adaptation, I'm also working to sort of figure out like what were folks doing with this faith, right? That in some cases was being violently, put upon them. And even when it wasn't straight up violence, I mean, often it was, even if it was more cultural violence, for example. And yet we see folks doing all kinds of like indigenous peoples and African peoples doing all kinds of things with these faith traditions, right? And so that's part of what I'm looking to do. What I've been doing is looking at these stories of how like folks are adapting these traditions and kind of making them their own. Like, what sort of agency is there in these experiences?
Yeah, it's challenging mental work once you decide you're going to take a descriptive approach to the affair, which is to say, like,
Yeah.
you're not going to go in with any assumptions. You're just going to actually like describe what's happening and not like, because I might normally, like when I had a fundamentalist kind of mind frame, I would look at these forms where indigenous folk adopted Christian practices, syncretize them, and practice some pagan belief, and view it as that's pagan practice or whatever, right? Or whatever. But looking at it from that perspective, I missed a whole bunch of shit that was actually happening. It's more dynamic. And if I was just interested in actually figuring out what really was going on when that happens, I'd be less prone to dismissing it as syncretism or whatever these theological concepts will kind of put on top of them and say, okay, what's really going on here, bro? Like, I think in both cases, you can say you could just discount what's happening as, oh, they're just being controlled and they have no role in reproducing this Christian faith in this way. And then the other thing, so they can say they have no role at all, or they're doing it because they're, but when you take the time just to describe it, it's more nuanced.
Yeah. And I'm, I'm definitely about empowerment, and empowerment doesn't mean that I simply have to affirm everything that's there and not be critical of it. But I also want to meet people where they're at. And I also want to recognize sort of how I've ended up where I'm at too. Like how did I get to where I'm at today? And so I have that cool privilege of being able to do that through my research. But sure. I also recognize, and here's maybe the positive thing I'll say about my experience, that my faith experience has been very empowering for me, and so it has been for me a liberating experience. Even as I continue to liberate and work to liberate my own ideas and my own thoughts, my faith has been generally a very liberating and empowering experience. Like I couldn't be where I'm at today without my faith and without my faith community. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I don't completely disown it, because I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. Like I've seen, I could tell you about the ugly. Like I've seen it. I've seen plenty of it. If I want to throw folks under the bus, I could do that. But I'm trying to seek empowerment of my peoples, and I'm also trying to meet people where they're at and challenge them where they're at. And in some cases, that may require also pushing them farther. But we're living in a time of reckoning, I think. I mean, for many people, it's been a time of reckoning their entire lives, right? But I think that when I say we're living in a time of reckoning, it's sort of the public discourse is at this point of reckoning, because of what's happened politically, because of, the way the lines have been drawn in our society. So I can't just kind of tiptoe around some of the issues that I see that are hurting our communities, issues of racism, issues of, violence around, gender identities and all these different things. But at the same time, I want people to know, what, I've done my homework. I know, at least I'm trying to know and understand how we got to where we are today. Now, what can we do with this? What can we do with what we have? Can we take what we have and make society better? And if we can't, then we got to get rid of it, or we got to get rid of the parts that aren't working.
I can tell you right now what isn't working. Shitty coffee. Shitty coffee will ruin your day. It has a potential of ruining your life. Could ruin your marriage. Could ruin your job prospects. Could ruin your teeth. It can ruin your clothes. Bad coffee is going to ruin a gang of shit, so steer clear of that. Adhere instead, I think it was Paul, stick close to good coffee and clear thinking. And I think we'll be well on our way. You won't see the last of Dr. Calvillo because I do still have this aching back, and I'm hoping he can figure out some kind of medicine he can prescribe me. And for more, follow Jonathan on Twitter. And there's one thing I always like to leave folks with, and they're probably waiting for it now, but I'm not going to give it to you because it's a little element of surprise. But